Chapter 5 PowerPoint Part 3. We just finished talking about how evolution occurs more rapidly in populations of GMOs. I want to quickly define what GMOs are. GMOs are genetically modified organisms, and they are produced through the process of genetic engineering. In genetic engineering, scientists are going to take a gene from one organism and they are going to insert that gene into another organism. So the new organism is going to express whatever trait that gene codes for. An example that is very common in the United States is Roundup-resistant soybeans. Scientists have inserted a gene that makes these soybean crops resistant to Roundup, which is a non-selective herbicide, meaning normally when Roundup is sprayed onto plants, any type of plant, it will kill all those plants that it comes in contact with. In the United States, we are growing these Roundup-resistant soybeans. This means that farmers now have the ability to spray Roundup over their soybean crops, and it will kill all of the other plants except for the crop that they're trying to grow, which in this case is soybeans. The image on the right-hand side is showing you that a lot of other countries actually have bans or restrictions on GMOs. They either require very specific labeling, and that means separation of genetically modified organisms from non-genetically modified organisms. But in the United States and Canada, we don't require any special labeling, and there is no ban on using genetically modified organisms. In California, they were trying to pass a law in which genetically modified organisms would have to be labeled, but this did not pass. We are now going to shift to talk about how evolution is going to shape ecological niches and determine species distributions. The graph that you see on the bottom shows us a range of tolerance, and this is the limit to the abiotic conditions an organism can tolerate. The example on the bottom just shows temperature, but it could be precipitation, it could be pH, or any other abiotic conditions. All species will have an optimum range, which is what we see in orange, right in the middle. That optimal environment is the best environment in which species, or I should say individuals, can survive, grow, and reproduce. As you move further away, again, in this case we're talking about temperature, as you get more cold and more warm, here and here, we get to a range in which organisms can survive and grow, but they don't often reproduce. And then if you get to either extreme, which is noted in our white sections down here, this is an area in which organisms just can survive. They won't grow, they're not going to reach maturity, and they are not going to reproduce. Now, the fundamental niche is the ideal conditions for a species. The fundamental niche is going to establish the abiotic limits on a species' persistence, meaning it's going to help determine the optimal conditions in which that organism can survive. Now, the fundamental niche, although may be very broad at times, isn't actually what the organism lives in. The organism lives in the realized niche, and this is the range of abiotic and biotic conditions, again, under which the species lives. And this helps to determine the species distribution, or the area of the world in which it lives. We have two different categories that organisms fall under, and that can be a niche generalist or a niche specialist. A niche generalist is a species that can live under a wide range of conditions, which means that if their environment is going to change, they will often be the ones who are able to survive because they can live in a wide range of conditions. A niche specialist, on the other hand, is a species that can only live in a specific habitat. They do very well as long as their environment is constant. Once that environment starts to change, they are at risk of extinction or just lowered population sizes. If we look at our two examples down here, the image on the left-hand side is showing you a meadow spittlebug, and this is a common example of a niche generalist. They have a very broad diet and a very wide habitat preference. On the right-hand side, we have a skeletonizing leaf beetle, which is a niche specialist, the opposite of the meadow spittlebug. He has a narrow diet and a very specific habitat preference. Now, environmental change will affect how species are distributed. So some areas, if we just talk about one example, receive more precipitation than other areas, or some areas receive less precipitation than other areas. If you change the amount of precipitation that an area is getting, you're going to change the species that can live there. Now, some species have the ability to adapt, for example, by moving physically, but other organisms don't have that ability. When you're talking about your animal species, yes, they can pick up, they can move. Birds can fly to other areas. Some organisms are really slow, like turtles, aren't going to be able to move very quickly and adapt to the changing environment. Whereas other organisms like plants, they can't just like pick up their roots and walk across to another area. So they are very dependent on whether or not the wind is dispersing their seeds. The image on the right-hand side is showing you pollen records based on sediments in local lakes for 3 tree species in North America. Changes in climatic conditions after the Ice Age produce substantial changes in distribution of the plants over time. And I want you to make a note that plants are often followed by animals. So if the food source for the animals is changing, the animals will follow along with the plant species. So how do we predict future species distributions? We do try to make predictions of what's going to happen, especially with global climate change occurring, but it's difficult for us to accurately do so. The image on the right-hand side is just showing you 2 different pine trees and what we have as a current distribution, and then what we expect the distribution to be like in the year 2100. For the red pine, which is the top example here, you can see that although there's a lot of red pine in the northern United States currently, by 2100, you can see that there's almost no red pines located, and again, this is a result of global climate change. The image on the bottom is just looking at a different pine, the loblolly pine, and again, you can see that the range is varying from kind of like the lower eastern United States, and it's actually shifting up to even our region in New Jersey and, Pennsylvania and New York. Now, environmental changes can lead to species extinction. If a species is not able to adapt to its changing environment, or if the changes are happening too quickly for the species to be able to adapt, that organism will become extinct. They estimate that 99% of all species that have ever lived on Earth are now extinct, although sometimes this occurs either by mass extinctions or by the replacement of a new species. So why do species go extinct? Sometimes there are no favorable environments, geologically close enough to move to. For example, the polar bear is very dependent on sea ice as a vital habitat for hunting seals, which are its prey. So if the polar bears lose the sea ice, there's nowhere more north for them to go, so they might become extinct. Sometimes species become extinct because there's competition with native populations, and if they're unable to move, they might be outcompeted. And sometimes, again, changes just may occur too rapidly for adaptation to occur, which is one of the concerns that we have with global climate change, is that organisms might not be able to adapt to a rapidly changing environment. The images at the bottom are just organisms that have gone extinct, have, existed on Earth before: ivory-billed woodpecker, the woolly mammoth. But these are organisms that are no longer on Earth. So how do we understand this evolution of life? Well, we look at the fossil record. Fossils are remains of organisms that have been preserved in rock, and much of what we know about evolution comes from our fossil record. Because most organisms decay and decompose very, very quickly, we don't actually have a lot of fossils that show the full extent to the diversity that once existed on Earth. The way fossils are formed is the organism dies. It needs to be covered with sediment before decomposition occurs, and that material becomes fossilized. So the tissues may actually be decomposed first, because the tissues decompose faster than bones. So a lot of times we may not have the soft tissue of the organism, but we'll have the bones, which is what we can see in this fish example at the bottom. If you remember back to biology, you talked about the law of superposition, and this is where older fossils are found further down in the sediment, and we can use the law of superposition to try to estimate the age of our fossils. So again, the lower they are, the older the organism is. And like I said before, most organisms do not become fossils. On Earth, we have had 5 mass extinctions. A mass extinction is when you have a relatively large number of species that go extinct in a very short period of time. And again, this is determined by our fossil record. Like I said, we have 5 global mass extinctions. I'm just going to talk about 2 of them. About 251 million years ago, as we can see right here, about 90% of our marine species and 70% of our land vertebrates went extinct. At about 65 million years ago, as we can see right here, we had about half of Earth's species, including the dinosaurs, go extinct. Now, while we don't know the cause of the first extinction we talked about here, the one that occurred 251 million years ago, there is a great debate going on about the most recent extinction, but there is almost near consensus. So a lot of scientists agree that the most probable cause for the extinction was a large meteorite striking Earth and producing a dust cloud that encased the planet. Because we had all this dust encasing our atmosphere, it blocked incoming solar radiation, which caused a near halt to photosynthesis. Because you have fewer producers, you're going to have fewer consumers, and that's what a lot of scientists agree caused the extinction of dinosaurs. What I want to point out on this slide is that extinctions are the ultimate result of changes to the environment. There are a lot of scientists that predict there is a 6th mass extinction taking place, especially in the last couple decades. They actually say it's on the magnitude of the previous 5 mass extinctions, and the estimates of extinction rates vary between 2 to 25% by the year 2020. So in contrast to the previous mass extinctions, scientists agree that this one is caused by humans. The other ones, although we may not know the cause, there were not humans then, so humans weren't the cause of the mass extinctions. How we are contributing, things like habitat destruction, overharvesting, introduction of invasive species, climate change, and emerging diseases all are contributing to an increase in the number of organisms that are going extinct. Again, most of these changes occur fairly quickly. We will go in and cut down a forest so we can build homes, or cut down a forest to use the wood for lumber. And organisms are not able to move or adapt in time to avoid extinction. Recovery from the current mass extinction, they estimate, could take up to 500,000 human generations. So it's not something that we're going to be able to stop and fix overnight, but we can start making changes to reduce the amount of extinction that is taking place. That is the end of this PowerPoint, and we will hopefully get to Chapter 6 in the future.